Yes, he did.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another edition of Donnybrook, looking a little bit like hopscotch once again. We are separated and socially distancing. 'Tis the season. Thank you so much. And by the way, we'll have a second half hour tonight. We're going to be talking to Dr. Fred Buckhold, internal medicine doctor with SSM Health, SLUCare, who's going to join our panel, which is headed up by the news director of the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese, along with one of our founders. I bet he never thought he'd see this when he started the show in 1987, Bill McClellan from the Post-Dispatch. Ray Hartmann, another founder, was there at the beginning, and he joins us tonight as the host of In the Know on KTRS weeknights at 9 o'clock, and he's also writing for the Riverfront Times, which he founded, back in the day. And from just about every major media source in town, from 97.1, the Dave Glover Show, along with the St. Louis American, 590 AM, and STLmag.com, Alvin Reid. Everybody, thanks for joining us. And Wendy, we're going to start with you. I want to ask you about the decision by Sam Page, St. Louis County executive, to close all of the 60 St. Louis County parks last week. This morning, Mayor Lyda Krewson, mayor of the city of St. Louis, on my radio program on KMOX, said she thought about it, but she's not closing parks in the city yet. What do you think?
Art Holiday and Jennifer Blome regularly check in with a former colleague who lives in Italy. Her name is Jill Weinrich, and she is essentially telling us what our future is. And she is from St. Louis, and it really puzzles her and makes her somewhat frustrated when she sees that over here, and while she acknowledges that in terms of density of population, there's 2 completely different situations. But she said in Italy, when they were quarantined or told to stay at home, people were expected to actually stay at home. And there was a Belgian study that was just recently released about something called we're all learning so much about this kind of thing. Something called the slipstream. When you run by or walk, even from a safe distance, a very, very low velocity wind can still pick up droplets and carry them to other people who are in the vicinity. So I applaud Dr. Page. I hope that Mayor Krewson will change her mind soon. I understand that it's therapeutic for people. If you're sitting outside on your porch or what have you, if you have to go outside, just make it brief. And I'm not a doctor, but I think when we're told to stay home in order to combat this or flatten the curve, we have to stay home.
Charlie, as someone who walks in Forest Park every day, I'm really glad and surprised and proud that Lyda Krewson has not closed parks, because I think there's a tendency to think, what will history say about me? And I want to do at least as much as the man in the county, as Dr. Page. And I admire Lyda Krewson for keeping Forest Park open. And as Wendy said, therapeutic, I think it is. And I think more and more people are being careful when they're in the park. At first they weren't. They were crisscrossing and bicyclists zooming by. But I see more and more people being safe and getting off the path when somebody else approaches. And I for one, am glad that Forest Park is open.
Well, disclaimer, because I'm on the board for Kirkwood Parks and Recreation. The parks are still open, and we're not overrun with a lot of people. And I think it's noted that don't do the playground areas and things like that. But I'm kind of with you. I think it's the last bastion. If we really got to the point where we had to close the parks, well, then we close the park. There's no problem with that. But I don't know if we're there yet, and I could be wrong. But I'm I still favor keeping them open. Now, the county is different than individual municipalities, which is different than the state of Missouri, which is different than the United States of America, which is closed. I guess all of the, the national parks are closed, correct? So, I mean, every level has got to make their own decision, I guess.
I agree with Sam Page and applaud him for doing it. I don't criticize whether it's Kirkwood or Lida, because it is a reasonable people disagrees situation. Absolutely, playgrounds should be closed. Absolutely. And campgrounds, for example, Missouri has, did I just lose the mic?
No, we can still hear you.
Showing my Zoom ability. In Missouri, the...
Hey, by the way, Zoom,
I think old people shouldn't do Zoom.
Wasn't it?
Old people can't do Zoom. In Missouri, 87 parks are open, but they closed the campgrounds. In Illinois, all of them are closed. Everybody's different.
It is.
I do think that it's really important that campgrounds and playgrounds be closed. And I happen to think Sam Page made the best decision.
I will say, Sam Page had a very interesting explanation. He said that, they follow people with Google Analytics now, which I did not know, but he found out that transportation in the county actually decreased 30 to 50%, except in parks where it increased 83%. And he said when the state closed some of its parks, travel to St. Louis County parks went through the roof. At the very time, the park security team was elsewhere maintaining security, so they just couldn't do it. But I did talk to Katrina Benhold, who's the Berlin bureau chief for the New York Times this week, and she said that in Germany, where their mortality rate is low, the parks are open. So you guys are right. I mean, different strokes for different folks. But in Boston, they have a curfew. When do you think it's time for the city of St. Louis and the county to be like Boston and close everything down at 9 o'clock and reopen at 6 a.m.?
I think it's going to depend on where this peak ends up. We saw, at least in the last 24 hours, a greater increase than we had prior in the county, I believe. If the numbers continue to increase, then I think that might be something that local leaders look at. I think that there's danger in any direction for politicians at this point.
I think it's like a lot of things that for example, I'm somebody who gets off of a radio show and walks his dog at 11 o'clock, and I certainly no problem with social distancing when one does that. But if you're talking about businesses, I think most of the people that would be out, I would think, are going to essential businesses. Now, if I'm wrong, if it's a situation where there's people congregating in a bar, I understand it. But if you're practicing social distancing, I don't really see where that curfew would make a difference.
Well, hey, I mean, if you told
Alvin, before you begin, Alvin, just got a text we can't put on the air. Viewer wants to know, where's Ruben?
Oh, Ruben's agent called and said this free stuff is over. No, we had a big day out by the fire pit. Riley the dog and Ruben the cat were in the backyard for a lot of the day, so they're probably just plumb tuckered out.
Well, let me ask you, Alvin, what did you think of the editorial in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch lambasting the city treasurer, Tashara Jones, for not enforcing any parking regulations in the city? That's what the treasurer does generally, but during this coronavirus crisis, she decided to stop enforcement of parking meters. And then the Post-Dispatch complained, look, people are parking in front of fire hydrants and in driveways, and they're not pulling over during the day when they're supposed to be cleaning the streets. And they said that she should be turning over all of that revenue from the parking division to the city for general revenue because the city has a $50 million shortfall. What do you say? Did we lose Alvin?
Alvin?
Okay, first,
I think he's
throughout the state.
There he is.
Go ahead, Alvin.
Throughout the state, all right, well, the state said you can fish without a license. There's a lot of things going on where people are given like a little carte blanche in these times. Maybe parking is like that. Now, people act irresponsibly. 2 weeks ago, going on 3, drove up to Chicago, and people are driving 90 miles an hour because the police basically aren't stopping people on the interstate highways. That doesn't make it right. That's just a reality of it. I'm sorry. The Post-Dispatch editorial board they're like the American many ways. We can advocate for you. We can advocate against you. And they are again Tashara Jones. And Jeffrey Boyd mysteriously shows up in this editorial. And, if Tashara says the sky is blue, some kind of way, Jeffrey Boyd and the Post-Dispatch are going to say it's green. I'll take that for what it's worth. But I wouldn't turn any over to general budget right now either. We spend countless minutes, if not hours, on the show talking about what's wrong with the city of St. Louis, and it's coming out of City Hall. So I wouldn't just be turning the money over to general budget either at this time. To me, that would be irresponsible.
Well, originally before we've had this sort of evolving science regarding COVID-19, and if you think back to those early days, it was all about hard surfaces and that kind of thing, and the weather was cool. And she has traffic police, if you will, to think about and their safety. She was also trying not to discourage people from coming into the city. So I was actually all in favor of her suspending the parking. It's hard for me to believe that unless anybody could produce, it sounds like anecdotal evidence in terms of parking against fire hydrants and blocking driveways, suddenly people forget.
And nobody did that. Nobody did that until 3 weeks ago, right?
Exactly.
I will say, I think that the city needs the money more than the parking division. If she has receipts from the parking meters, she should send that over to the city, which is losing money because it's going to be losing that 1% earnings tax as well as the sales tax.
That's the way I feel too, Charlie. I'm a little torn about not charging anybody to park now, and I think that I don't really have a problem with that. But the city is in such dire financial straits right now, and the idea that we're going to keep the parking money over here in the treasurer's office. I just don't think that's good. I think this is a point where Tashara Jones, who wants to be mayor and will surely want that money when she's mayor, should say, for right now, I'm going to just be giving the city whatever I can help with.
Charlie, may I correct my fellow founder and you on this?
Now, don't start talking about the law in Jefferson City says this. Go on, Ray.
You got my script for me? Let me tell you first of all, as to Alvin couldn't said it right. The editorial board has got a vendetta against Tashara Jones, and to which it's entitled, I guess, but that's all this is.
That's not fair.
It is fair. I think it's wrong, right? Bill, they called her out a few weeks ago. I had her on the show. They called her out 3 different times on 3 different subjects, including blaming her about Bernie Sanders. I mean, in 8 days. I mean, but set that aside.
I know you had her on the show, but that doesn't mean that the post.
No, I'm just saying when I was talking to her about that, it was right after they had called her out on 3 different topics in 8 different days. In 8 days. My point is this: that she is not the police chief. The police can continue to enforce laws. If somebody's parking where they can't park, if they're blocking an intersection, there's nothing keeping the police from ticketing somebody, having their car towed. Tashara is about the parking meters. I think you can make a reasonable case for the parking meter revenue not to be separate, but it has to be done legislatively. And it's not Tashara's. She did make. No, she did. And
Ray,
she's got a job to do. She's doing it well. And I think she made the right decision.
Yeah.
No, she did.
Ray, every once in a while, you always contradict yourself in some of these matters.
I'm not contradicting myself.
You always want local control, right?
Charlie,
the city over the state, and now you want the state.
The treasurer's a state office, Charlie. That's why her election's up in November and not in March. You'd have to change the law to change how the treasurer's operation works. It's not some wonkish decision. It's different than. No. Do you know that's happening?
For a long time,
the election's not the same time as the mayor.
I think as a panel, as a group, we agreed through the years of Larry Williams that all that money should have been going to the city.
I think you can make that case right now. I'm just saying he can't do it unilaterally.
I don't think I ever said that, but Larry Williams left about the same time I was coming on full time. So but I don't think I ever
I
You
think
may
you
be
can
right.
make the
Okay,
argument
historians
that
will-
you
Larry
can't
Williams
change-
on
Okay,
you
let's go to
cannot
Ray on
change
this
the
next
law.
topic.
I was afraid of Larry Williams, by the way. I'm not afraid of anybody.
Okay, Ray, in Alton, Illinois, the mayor there, I think his name is it Brant Walker?
Brant Walker.
Brant Walker. He had this dictum that people had to socially distance and stay out of bars. And turns out he said that on a Friday. On Sunday, they arrested his wife, and he told the police, "Don't give her any special treatment." Couldn't he have called the lady on the cell phone and say, "Hey, the long arm of the law is coming down on you. Get out of there. Get out the back door." I mean, that's what I would have done. That's what we all would have done. Come on.
Frankly, and I know it's a serious situation for them. We shouldn't make light of it, but we're all spending a lot of time in our bunkers every day trading internet memes and cartoons and everything. And this sort of was the Housewives of Alton episode. And everybody kind of found it bringing a smile to their face. To be clear, what he did on Friday was called upon his police department to issue citations. Then he gets a call at 1 a.m, and they've broken up a ridiculous gathering of a lot of people in a bar. And it turns out that his wife is one of those people, which is interesting. And in the old days, I guess they would have brought the politician's wife home. But in this case, not only did they not do that, but he the next day does a press release and a Facebook post that's a sort of virtual capture of a marital argument in public in which he excoriates her and basically tells the police to treat her like everybody else. And it was, in a strange way, a kind of a fun story, not to minimize their seriousness of their
I
situation.
don't think it was fun for the mayor.
Right, that's right. And I don't mean to make light of his plight.
But a lot, I have heard from and talked to other wives who are of the belief that things might not have been going very well between them leading up to this.
They probably are now.
They certainly aren't getting any better, that's for sure. But I felt sorry for both of them. That's a terribly uncomfortable position as a politician in an area like that. He doesn't have any choice. He can't say, "Let my wife Marion Wormer, let her off the hook." You can't do that when you're the mayor of a community like that.
Couldn't he have texted her? He could have texted her.
What?
But no, he didn't know.
At 1:30 in the morning?
He didn't know it. Wait, my wife might be any place, but I think I know where she's at 1:30 in the morning. So thus, if he knew, my guess is he knew she wasn't at home. Okay. So thus, when you get this phone call, you're in a situation where you have to let the law play out. He had no choice. Now, I think we all would probably say, like, I would not let my wife get arrested or cited. I would do something as the mayor. But I think we grew up in different times. And today, I think she's got to go, hey.
Charlie, go ahead, Bill.
The good thing about this, I think, Charlie, is this is 2020, and being famous has its own reward. And I think the two of them are going to make some money out of this. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how they're going to do it, but the mayor and his wife, I think they'll come out of this. If they want to be together, they'll come out of this fine.
Well, you have to understand what sets this story apart, really, and the reason it was on the Huffington Post and I'm sure other national outlets, was the fact that on Monday, the mayor made a decision, and the reason we're talking about it, to put it on Facebook and to call out his wife publicly for her bad judgment and so forth. And that's what set, and maybe to Bill's point, it'll make the money. I don't know. But the point is, we wouldn't even be talking about this if it just happened. And so it's really, while I share sympathy with him, he is the one that made that judgment to make it a story that ended up going at least a little bit national.
Did
You
it
think he
not
went right
remind
back
you
to sleep
of,
after he
John
got the
Car-
That's what's,
after he got the call? Do you think he's like, hey, send her down, and just went right back to
there's all
No.
kinds of hypotheticals on this one that we shouldn't be doing.
Did it not remind you of St. Louis Alderman John Carlos Muhammad, who this year on a Monday had a press conference urging the police to crack down on speeding motorists in his ward, and he got arrested on Thursday?
That's right. That's
Same.
right. But it wasn't.
No, it's fair, but who
but it
does this
wasn't
with
Mrs. Muhammad.
who does this with a Facebook post and a press release? I mean,
Well,
that's
hey,
all I'm saying. It's just different.
I want to go to Bill McClellan on this one. Bill, I didn't see the interview. Josh Hawley was on Tucker Carlson, and apparently someone told me that he's sounding more and more like the Soviet Politburo of the 1970s. But he is, of course, a fiscal conservative Republican senator from Missouri in Washington, D.C. But it seems like the spirit of Bernie Sanders has taken over him.
Well, first, let me explain that I certainly didn't see anything on Tucker Carlson. That's not, I'm
Not
watching.
PBS.
I'm watching Forensic Files or PBS at night.
Right.
But I did read a column that Josh Hawley had in the Washington Post that was astounding. It sounded like something from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, that people should get 80%, the government should pay 80% of a person's salary so that nobody's laid off or furloughed. It sounded great to me, but I thought, why is Josh Hawley saying this? And why is Josh Hawley saying this to the Washington Post? I mean, Josh Hawley's base in rural Missouri doesn't read the Washington Post. So, I don't either, but somebody sent this to me. And I can't figure it out at all. Josh Hawley sounds like somebody I could support.
Interesting.
Well, Josh Hawley, the only news releases that we are receiving regularly from his office in Washington has to do with China and holding China accountable. He's not calling it the China virus like the president is, but he is all for, and many political leaders are lining up for some type of accountability when it comes to Chinese leadership and what they knew when they reported it. But in terms of the Washington or the Washington Post, I've not seen that. So that's pretty fascinating, Bill.
I actually sent you an email on it, Wendy. So you were at work, so you didn't get a chance to see it. But
I found it interesting in that was one of those stories that you read twice, because it wasn't that I could not believe what I was reading, but it was almost like I gotta substantiate this with myself that he is saying these things, because that's flat out okay. What's that S word? Everything, socialism, whatever. Like, hard times hit the employer. So instead of the employer paying the people, Congress can pay the people for an indefinite period of time. Okay. And if you lost your job, you get your job back, and then we'll pay your salary. And it was just out of the blue. And I guess I could support it. But I'm just like, where did this come from? And let me tell you what, when the Titanic was going down, there was a first rodent to jump off. So I'm not saying that's what it is, but maybe he knows something we don't.
Alvin, I gotta say, I don't think there's anybody that's attacked Josh Hawley more consistently than I have. And I have to say, I was astonished when I read what he did. Now, there is the detail that one of the more compelling points he makes is to crack down on the Communist Party of China. But at the same time, he refuses to utter a peep when Donald Trump, his president, keeps calling Xi, the head of the Communist Party, as his close friend, and never does anything but go out of his way to grovel about how wonderful he is. And so Josh Hawley, as Alvin said, it was unbelievable.
Right.
What he said, but he doesn't back it up in terms of the politics of it. He still falls in line with the opposite view. And he got called out today. I think it was Mark Levin, his name. He's going to get called out on the right for what he
Oh,
said
he's
in
gonna-
Washington.
Absolutely. He's
He
going
will
to get
be
skewered. But he
assaulted.
also, but you know what? Before it is helping the worker man and woman out there, it'll be because he also took a shot at major corporations and told them basically, hey, you're at the back of the line. And now if he wants to do something, he makes sure that there's some regulation to all these billions of dollars that are about to get pumped out there, and that you can't just buy your own stock or pay all your CEOs' salaries and bonuses with this money. So we'll see if he backs up his words.
And he
But
also-
his words were surprising.
He also had a little part about it, about supporting churches, which of course sounds great, but you start getting into some church state issues when you decide which churches and synagogues and mosques are going to get what kind of money.
Well,
That's a
zero are going
slippery
to get
slope,
that because
I
that's
think.
unconstitutional, flat
Well,
out.
he
Guys,
wants to do
Let's
that.
move on to Wendy Wiese. Wendy, by the way, you're of the ilk. Do you remember there was a PBS show called Zoom back in the 1970s?
I remember that.
Alvin,
I do remember that.
Okay.
Vaguely,
here
I
we are.
remember Aretha Franklin asking the question, "Who's zooming who?" And I mean, I
Right.
guess we're all zooming all the time, aren't we?
Yes.
Wendy, do you think that the plan to have the Cardinals and other Major League Baseball teams playing in Arizona in front of empty stadiums will fly? Now, the baseball commissioner Rob Manfred has said, he hasn't endorsed it, he hasn't poo-pooed it yet. However, what do you think? Would that fly?
I'm really excited about the football draft coming up April 23rd to the 25th, the NFL draft. I was all in for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes when I heard about the state of Arizona being turned into, Field of Dreams or Desert of Dreams or whatever. And then, the devil's in the details, and it just sounds too it sounds too 2001 A Space Odyssey for Michael Crichton. Really, the reality of it with the baseball players having to sit in the stands 6 feet apart, and how does an umpire? It's just kind of, I don't see how it works. And as much as I hate the thought of losing the season, I think we've lost the season if it goes that far.
Got about 30 seconds to go. Alvin, what do you think?
Reid plan. Okay, I've already come up with it. If we can get 3 months in, you play August, September, October. You only play half a season. The National League only plays National League teams. American League only plays American League teams. You play 3 at home, 3 on the road. That's 84 games. Then you do the playoffs of the World Series in Arizona and Florida.
That's great.
Alvin stole,
All right, there you go. I'm afraid, folks,
Alvin
we're
stole
out of
that
time
idea
for this
from the
segment,
fifth column in
but
the
we
American.
will be back, and Dr.
Oh, wait, you wrote it.
Buckhold from SSM Healthcare will join us, so don't touch that dial.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Yes, he did.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
And thank you so much for joining us for the second half. This is Donnybrook Part 2. You know all the panelists who were with you for the first 30 minutes. And now we're joined by Dr. Fred Buckhold, who's an internal medicine physician with SSM Health, SLU Hospital, and SLUCare. Dr. Buckhold, thanks for making your debut appearance on Donnybrook. Good to have you with us.
Well, this is the most intimidated I've been since I was in med school. So thank you, and very glad to be here.
No, don't.
That intimidation won't last very long, Doctor. We promise.
Oh, hey, if we can do it, you can do it. That's for sure.
Sure.
So in the last segment, we were discussing whether or not city officials should close parks as they did in the county. And we're pointing out it's kind of mixed around the world. Germany, for example, seems to be keeping its coronavirus deaths relatively low, and yet their parks are open. St. Louis County, the parks are closed. You're a physician. What do you think?
Well, it all kind of goes back to this idea of distance. And I think what's been fascinating about this is every culture's kind of DNA comes out. I think Germans are pretty notorious for following rules, and I think when they say stay away, there tends to be a little bit more obeyance of that rule. And you see it kind of in Japan and South Korea as well. In the United States, where I think that mentality is a bit different. And so, we, until there's a little bit more structure, this idea of really staying away, keeping that distance isn't always held. Just the difference I've seen going to grocery stores in the last 3 weeks, lots of people shopping around, kind of business as usual. Now, if you go to the grocery store, there's like a line to go inside. They hold you down. The big grocery stores hold you down to one person per household. And I think that it's somewhat draconian, but it kind of has to happen to get that distance that we need to have. So I think with the parks, the same thing. If you can feel confident that people are going to stay away from each other, sure, I think you could be liberal about that policy. I think if that confidence isn't there, or you're concerned, I think you have to be a little more strident. I think every country and every region is a bit different with that personally.
Well, look out, doctor, because here comes a question about state policy from our buddy Ray Hartmann. Ray?
Oh, there is? Oh, well, I didn't. Actually, I'm more interested in the president saying to people, what do you have to lose school for medicine? And as opposed to first do no wrong. And I'm curious as to whether you think people, what is your message to patients or others who want to try self-medicating with hydroxychloroquine or other prescriptions that the president mentions?
Yeah, and I think the first thing always I think thinking about COVID and what's so interesting and tough about it is like nobody really knows the right answer. So does hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil is the name we're used to calling it as well, does it work or not? I don't think any of us really know with any certainty. That the stuff that's been published, particularly the French studies and a couple out of China, as said before, and a couple other venues, is like they don't even meet the like minimum requirements of science. And that's understanding that we're in the time of a crisis, we're trying to figure out what to do, and we're willing to accept like kind of things not well done. This is even below that standard. So it even adds to this confusion about what's right and what's wrong. But even in where I work and really across the region, I think if people are insanely sick, we kind of change our mentality a little bit of just, we'll throw the kitchen sink at them. But the trick with hydroxychloroquine is really twofold. One is it can cause heart arrhythmias. And in a healthy population, it's not much of a risk. When you have somebody that's intubated, is on all these different medicines because they have a breathing tube down their throat, they're insanely sick, they're on medicine to keep their blood pressure up because they're in what we call shock, which makes your blood pressure really low. You add kind of another piece to that. It's like adding that last piece of sand on a sand pile and just everything kind of crumps away. There's a real concern about causing what we call arrhythmias or heart disturbances that can kill somebody. And so the long answer, or short answer today, is we don't know. And this is why we do good science to try to figure that out. And so that's kind of the tension we have, is we don't know if it's helpful or harmful. And again, I think the biggest thing is what's going to help us so much more than this drug is really distancing, really enforcing hand hygiene, maybe the face masks. There's so much more important than worrying about this hydroxychloroquine, which we'll really only use on the super, super sick, which is a small percentage of the patients that get this.
Well, now, go ahead, Wendy. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, Charlie.
I was just going to say the United Commercial Food Workers have asked the governor to require all visitors to grocery stores to be wearing masks. I don't think you'd be opposed to that, or would you?
No, I think that's one of those things that's low yield, or a low harm, decent benefit, and it's probably not going to save anybody's life, but it's certainly going to reduce the spread a little generally. And they're scared. I think anybody that's working in a public area right now in this time is scared, and that includes healthcare workers. I mean, we're nervous, and we're doing what we do because it's important. And honestly, the grocery store workers are incredibly important right now. It's the only way we're going to get our food. And I think anything we can do to make them at least feel safe, that has a low downside, which this does, is a bonus and a win.
I was going to ask you a question, Doctor, about grocery stores. I don't know if you've been in one lately, but I hear people say, geez, I wish it was one-way aisles. because you walk down and there's people coming right next to you. And, you might be 6 feet away from the people in front of you, but you're crossing people. Do you feel safe in grocery stores right now, or what's your sense of that?
I don't know if the word safe is there. I'm the designated person in my family to go. In fact, I have to go after this. I think trying to minimize the amount of time you go there and, it certainly minimizes the interaction. And so the one way is not a bad idea. That's the first I've heard of it. It's not terrible. And
it's being used. It's actually being used.
Is it really? Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I think things to minimize that contact is good. Now, if you run into one person and you've done a good job otherwise at a grocery store, I mean, the odds are still incredibly low. So I don't think you have to freak out, but this is really just important about minimizing the number of contacts, so that makes sense. And on a whole population, not just you or I that go there. It's the more connections people have between each other, the more it has a tendency to spread. And that's I think really the most important part.
I don't. Oh, go ahead, Wendy.
Go ahead, Ray.
Oh, I was going to say, I have a question for you, doctor. And first of all, I know I speak for all of us. Thank you. I mean, to you and all the healthcare professionals that are risking their lives for us every day, really, like first responders, really an amazing thing. Is there enough testing in St. Louis? And in particular, are you concerned about the disparity that seems to be there, where tests are harder to find in North City, North County, where they're needed the most, given the disproportionate deaths of African Americans?
Yeah. So no, there's not enough tests, and yes, I'm concerned, and particularly in places where there's less of a presence. So I mean, if you just think about where hospitals are in St. Louis, there's a density. We have two of the major academic centers in St. Louis, and then you draw a direct line west, and how many hospitals are there, going all the way out to St. Charles almost, and then you draw a line north and you draw a line south, and look how many there are. There's a stark difference, and I think that's kind of emblem, a problem our community's had for some time. But so the access that patients have kind of across the region is variable, and that's been there even before COVID. COVID has this kind of funny way of like really exploiting the flaws in our society and the flaws of any country's society to a massive degree, which is kind of equally fascinating and frightening. But the other big thing is really just the testing, and not even just the tests. So like we have a sample and we can do the test on that, but even the nasal swab, to do this, we have to stick kind of a long cotton or a Q-tip to the back of your nose, through your nose to the back of your nose, and have be able to put in a certain kind of plastic tube that will preserve that material. And we're short on those. That's probably our biggest rate limiting step right now, is that equipment. We could do more testing, but still it would be nice to have so much more. And that's, I think aside from the personal protective equipment, that's the second most frustrating thing is, we'd like to test more people. And what's scary to me, and what we were just talking about to my colleagues that take care of patients in the hospital today, is, patients that are positive are coming out of left field. Like you'll see them and say, there's no way you think this person has it. And you test them just kind of randomly or on a lark or on a hunch, and they're positive, and everybody's shocked. Whereas some of the people you think really would have it are testing negative. So, the idea, and I think where we'd like to get, is we could test everybody. Anybody that walks in a healthcare facility, we're testing to make sure and see what we're dealing with. And there's no way we can do that. And I don't see how we're going to be able to do that in the next couple of weeks when it's really critical. And that's, I think that's bothersome.
Go ahead, Wendy. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alvin.
No.
I'll wait.
I forgot. We've interrupted you twice. You go ahead.
No, 3 times. Go ahead. Let's make it a.
No.
Seriously, Alvin, go ahead.
No, all yours.
Make up your minds.
Wendy, it's your turn.
Dr. Buckhold, it seems that everything that we initially were told about coronavirus or COVID has, as you just said, has been thrown to the wayside. It isn't just older people. It isn't just this. It isn't just that. And it sounds as if the key will be in testing the people who have had coronavirus, who have had coronavirus or even COVID-19, I suppose, without having the really serious health consequences. Is that correct? Is there any way, or is there anything in the pipeline, in the works that would be able to test people who have had it and obviously have antibodies to put into the system to work in terms of a vaccine?
Yeah, well, so I'll kind of separate that out. I think there is an antibody test that's becoming commercially available. What that means is generally, once we've been exposed to a type of infection, as our immune systems learn to kind of deal with that, we develop antibodies to fight off and prevent that infection from having again. It's kind of, as with everything in medicine, it's complicated because you may have antibodies but not be able to fight it off. You may have antibodies and may not be immune, or you could still have the disease or even be contagious. We don't know any of that yet. So I think even with that information or having that test available, I think that uncertainty is there. We don't even know, say you test positive and you don't have symptoms anymore, like you felt bad and now you're better. We don't know how long you're going to be contagious. We're guessing it's 14 days after, or maybe even 7. But that's a hunch. I mean, it's based on some science and knowing how this virus works. But, if you ask somebody honestly, they don't really know for sure. We're just kind of guessing. And I think that's the scary thing about this is there's a lot of reasonable hunches, and we've made guesses based on kind of the first impressions that come out of China. But it's, these impressions are changing so fast. And, I think going to the vaccine question again, and Dr. Fauci's talked about this at length, even if we're lucky, we get a vaccine that works. And, with a number of my colleagues that do vaccine research, and they've been working on a flu vaccine for years, vaccine research and vaccine development is insanely hard. So, I mean, we're talking about even in the best scenario, we're ready in a year and a half. That's with assuming we find something that works. So there's just all these other variables that are unknown and how do we interpret these tests? And the testing is, I think, right now is very, very complicated because people could test positive even after they've had symptoms and feel better 6 weeks from now. What does that mean? Your guess is as good as mine. I think likely they're not contagious, but that's a huge concern.
Dr. Buckhold, we have a hotel in Florissant that's going to be used, I guess, in case there's that many patients. How does that work? I mean, is every room established like you would be in a hospital, or are you just basically in a bed in a room where somebody comes to check on you? I just wonder how it works exactly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think the bigger issue with expanding capacity is, do you have the workforce to deal with this? Honestly, and I'll get killed by my colleagues here, I think the doctor part is actually pretty easy because, we're even talking about, everybody's deployed more televisits and video visits. We could probably do some of that at a distance, if we could have some kind of iPad or something in the room, we could just check in on people. But it's your nurses that need to come in and administer medications and other people that go in to work with patients to have them feel better. They've got to be around. And, another issue that a lot of nursing homes are facing right now is people don't want to come to work because they're scared and they're not sure they have the protection and the equipment. And so, I think getting the physical space is probably the easiest part. How that looks is a great question. I mean, it's a giant unknown.
But they're the ones with the milder symptoms, are they not, Doctor?
Yeah, ideally, yeah. They're certainly not your ICU patients, but obviously. And I pray we don't even get there. I pray that that there's a capacity. And I think there's some plans in place before we even get there that I think are pretty solid. I think where I am at SLU, we've talked about using Cardinal Glennon if we have to because the volumes may be able to handle that, or we have a MASH tent apparently, which I haven't seen, but apparently can house 60 some odd patients in addition to what we have. So, I mean, there is some extra capacity elsewhere. And we have a new hospital too, which hasn't really been, it's been talked about, but it hasn't been really developed as an alternative, but it's going to be done soon. It certainly seems logical as a way to add capacity too. So,
Dr. Buckhold, if you watch the president's press conferences, you'll see the vice president and others with rather not cheery, but positive pronouncements about the equipment that's getting into the communities and the counties, from the surgical masks to the gowns to the tests to the ventilators. But then when I talk to doctors here in St. Louis, there seems to be a huge disconnect. They're complaining about the PPE and the resources they have when we're talking boots on the ground. What exactly are your colleagues saying with regard to the health community's ability to respond to this crisis here in St. Louis?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, and I think the biggest issue that has raised a lot of concerns, and frankly, the people above my pay grade have had to deal with a lot, is what's the right facial protection to use? So clearly wearing a plastic mask to go, or some kind of goggles to go over your face is important, but what's the best way to prevent the droplets from getting into our mouth, basically? So is it just a basic mask, of a surgical mask you see surgeons wear, or this thing that you've heard about called the N95, which is a little bit stronger barrier and really prevents particularly stuff that's in the air from getting from us inhaling that. And when you look at the science that's out there, nobody really knows for sure. And we have a massive shortage of these N95s, to the point in my own facility we're reusing them. Usually when I would see a patient wearing an N95, I would take it off and I would throw it away. Now we're using it throughout the day. So generally people, if they have it on, they'll leave it on throughout the day. We've created this system to kind of decontaminate them overnight, so we can reuse them the next day, which is just, and I credit my leadership for getting this set up in really 2 weeks' time. But and so when the CDC says the surgical mask is probably okay, wear the N95 if you can find one, that reeks to us on the ground of saying, they're just making a compromise because they know there's not enough supply. And we can't get any more N95s. If we wanted to, we pay a premium for them. My boss, my chair, is trying to buy them himself for his faculty and residents. The measures we're taking is to make sure we have some degree of safety and psychological safety too, knowing that we're going in to take care of somebody and being protected is troubling. And I did a night shift about 2 days ago. I brought in my own N95 just in case I didn't have any. I 6 weeks ago, just the thought of that would have been absurd to me. So yeah, we're very frustrated. And I think the idea that more is coming or more is on the way, we have yet to see it. And nobody is acting with confidence that they think they're going to get equipment. And it's not that we're short right now. We have plenty of material. I think it's more, we want to make sure we have material 6 weeks from now when this is still going on, and rationing that out.
Doctor, following up on your frustration and the fact that you said a vaccine is 12 to 18 months off, over 99% of the population hasn't been tested. How are we in St. Louis, and what is your feeling in the medical community of when we can come back to some degree of normalcy? Obviously, so many people are suffering economically.
Yeah,
but you don't want to bounce after the curve. What are people in your field, in your world, thinking?
Well, I think we have a couple of advantages that maybe not everywhere else has, or maybe some do. I don't really know. But one is, I'd say three. One is we weren't one of the first areas hit. So, we're not New York, we're not Seattle, we're not, Chicago, and New Orleans too is kind of the one that nobody's talking about that's really suffering right now. So we have time to prepare, and I think that preparation helps. The second big advantage St. Louis has is, the big organizations in St. Louis are generally working together, making sure that we're making sure that Barnes isn't taking all the PPE at the expense of SLU or Mercy or some other entity. And people are working in concert and collaboratively to help each other out, which is great. And then third is, I have to credit the mayor and the county executive for implementing this stay-at-home order early, which I'm sure comes with a political cost, and I'm sure it's an economic cost to a huge number of people, but it may really bear fruit really in the next 2 weeks. That was instituted 2 weeks ago now. We haven't seen really the plateau of patients that we would expect yet, but we haven't seen a huge number of patients either. And so when I look at the data, and the data is kind of spotty, but the doubling time is about 5 days, which is longer than what it is in other areas. And it may be of benefit to us. I don't know. But I think, again, we're planning for the worst. And I think that's really the thought.
Speaking of political costs, and obviously this is the first pandemic of most of our lives. I would really hope going forward that someone like Dr. Fauci would be completely separate, and Dr. Birx, for that matter, would be completely separate from the White House, because I think that we have seen politics really weaponizing this pandemic, and I think that's cost lives. If your political leader thinks it's nothing, then you think it's nothing, and you're not going to socially distance the way you should, or maybe you're still jumping on airplanes. As a physician, that would have to be, doesn't matter what way politically you're inclined, that would have to be somewhat of a frustration for physicians everywhere.
Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, I'm critical of anybody that doesn't do things the way I think they ought to be done. But Fauci is a legend. I mean, he literally wrote the book, for internal medicine, which I am. I mean, he's the editor of Remain textbook. So I mean, he's a godlike status for many of us. And I appreciate his independent thought. I think it's saved us, frankly.
Absolutely.
We've talked amongst, and again, across a set of colleagues that have a wide range of political beliefs. The CDC here is really the lack of clarity we have not gotten from the CDC, as contrast to Ebola 2 or 3 or I don't even remember what it was, 4 years ago, let's say. With Ebola, and again, granted, we didn't have nearly the numbers. We knew what that was. It was something that's been around for a while, but at least we had a plan, we had clear guidance. And so if we had a question, we could go to the CDC and say, oh, okay, this is what we do. Now we have, if you're out of personal protective equipment, put a piece of cloth around your face, like knowing that doesn't do anything to protect you. It keeps you from spreading, but I mean, you might as well go in there without anything. And for them to say that was, that was a point where I'm like, wow, I don't trust anything they're saying. And that's guided or that's clouded by the fact they're probably putting some good evidence out there, and there's good people that work there. But, I think that mistrust we have for that is again, something we've talked about. And, again, it kind of breaks my heart to say that, because that was one of the number one sites I would go to when I wanted to know what to do with something, particularly with infectious disease. That's very, very bothersome to me. It's kind of like like learning your parent is infallible, I guess. Are followable, but that's been bothersome. That lack of guidance, and leads to a lot of anxiety. Again, with this face mask issue, is are they saying that because the protection of me or my colleagues is at heart, or are they covered for the fact that they made a mistake in not getting enough equipment, and they're saying, well, this is good enough, and that's in healthcare, that's not acceptable. And anybody would you want somebody that's a good enough doctor, you want a great doctor and nurse and everything else.
Well, doctor, do you see a surge coming to St. Louis? And if so, do you think we're ready for that surge?
It's interesting. I freak out about every 3 days. So I'll look at the numbers, in our hospital, and then they kind of plateau for a little bit. So what was it when I looked at Sunday, we had a huge spike, and I was like, oh my goodness, like, okay, this week is going to be bad, and I'm kind of bracing for it. And then it kind of leveled off for the last couple of days. I think some of our other hospitals, I think their biggest limitation is the amount of people that are in the ICU. And I think that's starting to stretch people. And I think we're seeing that in our own ICUs. So even though our census isn't as high as it normally is, the ICU certainly is full and full of sick people. And so I think that's where we're going to feel that. And if the numbers go a little bit higher, I think that's going to strain our system. There's good plans to deal with it, but I'm not optimistic. But every time I get more pessimistic, the numbers kind of play out to give me a little bit of hope. But the next 10 days to me are really what's important. I think a week to the end of next weekend, if we haven't been really bombarded yet, I think we could start to say, all right, this might not be as bad as some other regions, but I think we still have some time to go.
Doctor, a point that's confused me is so many people have mild symptoms. Can you get a mild case of this, or when you get the virus, Do, do you have a severe case simply because your body's not fighting it off? Or like, could someone get even with a bad immune system, could you get a mild case of this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can get it asymptomatic. You could have no symptoms and carry it. I think what's been interesting about this is there's an element of this that makes people sick that we haven't figured out yet. So when you looked at the data out of China, it had more people above the age of 65 seem to suffer from this more than people under the age of 65. Here in the U.S., I think that we've seen a lot of people under the age of 65 that have gotten sick, and some have died. I think there's probably still a denominator problem. Like there's still a small number of people in that age group versus the wider amount of people that have probably had symptoms and not been tested. So I don't know. We don't know. The range or the percentage of people that die by a certain age demographic. But
Doctor, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry to say the unforgiving clock has said that our time is up for this segment. But thank you so much, Dr. Fred Buckhold, for joining us from
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate being on.
Appreciate it.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.